All right, so just want to welcome everybody this evening. How you doing? My name's Galen Tyler. I'm with the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign, aka the Poor People's Army. You know, we got a wonderful author that's going to be on here tonight. Going to be talking about the global police state, and Andy Willis, who's like a longtime leader, elder, in this movement, an educator, and an artist as well, who knows the author, William Robinson. He's going to introduce him. So just want to let everybody know that it's being recorded, and then we're going to give it to the author and let him decide how the ending of it goes in relationship to Q&A, all right? So, Andy, you want to go in and give a little background?
Okay. Yeah, I want to express my gratitude to everybody involved, Poor People's Army, setting this up and making the technical provisions. And particularly to Professor William Robinson, who amazingly, just immediately responded. We don't know each other actually very well at all. I kind of cold called him and asked him to do this, and he immediately responded that he would, and that the book that he wrote that speaks to the polarization in society that's going on all around us is really vital at this time. We as a people cannot go forward without understanding the content of this book. I don't know how to state it any stronger. I don't think you can overstate the importance of this knowledge. So when the knowledge is out there in society and the polarization is beginning to take place, that we have to pay a lot of attention to studying the knowledge that's coming forth. I mean, Professor Robinson has written, I think, 2 books since this book. I mean, he's on top of the global capitalist game plan, and their agenda is deadly, and we're seeing it played out in Gaza. And I'm going to be real brief in my introduction because I'm anxious to get to his presentation. But the one thing I will say, when I first came up into being a radical or revolutionary back in 1968, something like that, I didn't know what I was doing. I was playing off of instinct, and I began to learn. And I found out from my mentor, Nelson Peary, that learning required study. Oh, who wanted to study? We thought we was all going to just roll into this and change the world. No, he insisted that you have to study. So we did study, and we continue to study. And that the mark of a real serious revolutionary is that they study the world the way it is, not the way that they want it to be, or not come up with some magic ideas that are going to change it, but to really look at it hard. And that's what Professor Robinson has done. And I suggest everybody read the book. It's called The Global Police State, and other books that he's written about the nature of global capitalism. So without any more of my going on and on, I want to turn it over to him. So Professor William Robinson, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. I can't tell you how much of an honor it is to have received an invitation from the Poor People's Army. I hope I have something worthwhile to say to you who are in the very front lines of our struggle. And thank you personally also to Andy Willis for reaching out to me and for facilitating the invitation. So I am going to talk about the book, The Global Police State, but I want to go a little off script, and I want to start with a couple other things. And Gaza, of course, because the global police state is on full display. This barbarous genocide, this repression of students, they're 2 sides of the same war on the people that is the global police state. And both what's taking place here in our country right now and in in Gaza express this genocidal impulse of a global capitalism which is sinking into deeper and deeper crisis. We're really seeing here the fascist face of the global police state. I don't know, I understand that many of you are in Chicago, but I don't know if you're aware of what's exactly how it played out at the University of California at Los Angeles, but here what happened is on April 30th, what we can only call brown shirts, these fascist squads, which we believe some of them were IDF and some of them, of course, are organized by the Trump grassroots. They stormed the encampment. They had a violent attack for 5 hours. 100 people were hospitalized, 25 with serious injuries, while the cops, the police, pulled back, laughed, and watched the whole thing. The next morning, the governor condemned the students for supposedly inciting violence and ordered the police to attack yet a second time and arrest all of the students. So that's what we're facing. You guys, you know all of these, this data. At this point, the deaths in Gaza are some 45,000, 80,000 now injured. The attack on Rafah has already begun. Here in the United States, we've lost track of how many people are arrested. Literally, a few hours ago, the University of Chicago was stormed, and just as I was being introduced by Andy, I got word that Virginia Tech, the cops are spraying pepper and arresting everyone there, but we believe there's certainly over 3,000 arrests. There are now 200 universities around the world where there are student encampments, not just the United States, but all around the world, and this is growing. So what we're seeing, this is a manifestation of global police state. Our campuses are being militarized. The US Constitution on our campuses are completely being, and off campus, suspended. Unprecedented attack on academic freedom, on free speech, on the right to assembly. And the UCLA lesson, and now the lessons from elsewhere, other campuses show that we need to be prepared for terrorist violence now, backed by the state. And this repression of the Palestine solidarity movements is a dress rehearsal for an escalation of mass repression of what is to come as class and as mass social struggles heat up as this crisis deepens. So I want to say, I was originally going to start because Andy reached out to me by saying, he said he read the book, The Global Police State, and then he said that I had quoted Fred Hampton, which I did twice in the concluding chapter. And he said that the Poor People's Army, which is extending this invitation, many of you have your origins back in the 1960s and in the Black Panthers and in connections with Fred Hampton. I was going to start with a quote by Fred Hampton. I won't the whole quote, but the end of that quote says, "It's a class struggle, goddamn it." That's his words. And so he critiqued capitalism. He called specifically, our struggle is against capitalism. So now we're living in different times, but it's the same system that he critiqued. It's the same class perspective that he put forward. But if we fast forward 50 years from when Fred Hampton was around, capitalism has become more expansive, more deadly, more destructive. And we are facing simply an unprecedented global crisis. The global police state that I'm going to talk about is a response by the ruling classes to this crisis, an attempt for them on their terms to resolve this crisis. And us from below, resistance is ongoing. The fight back is breaking out everywhere. So there's always been these flashpoints. At any one moment, there's a specific flashpoint, which is the leading edge of mass popular struggle. So in the United States and worldwide. So we could say, if we started the story with the global financial collapse of 2008 that I'm going to speak about, because that began this big global crisis. We could say Occupy Wall Street at 2011 was at one time the leading edge. Then Ferguson in 2014, then Standing Rock in 2016, the BLM uprising in 2020. And of course, if we look worldwide, this is all over the world. And now it is Gaza, and it's the resistance here in the United States and really the global intifada in solidarity with Palestine and against this genocide. This genocide has touched a raw nerve, and it's underscored what we already know, that masses of people around the world, we're going to talk about the United States, but around the world, are thirsty for radical change, dying figuratively and literally for radical change. And the absolute savagery of this genocide has touched that raw nerve. But I want to say that what's taking place in Gaza has a larger meaning, because it is holding up a mirror to possible futures all around the world for many people. So much is at stake with the outcome of this genocide. It is sharpening all of the contradictions of global capitalism. So we are entering a period of great upheavals, of momentous changes, and of uncertainties. And of course, that opens up the grave dangers of fascism. That's what we're facing, and World War III. But it also opens up the possibilities for radical transformation and emancipation from below. But here's the thing. We can't effectively fight a system that we do not fully understand, that we don't understand. The sooner we give up the illusion of reforming this system, the better. Of course, we still fight for any and every reform that will improve the situation and the conditions of the masses of working people. But we have to overthrow this system. So I want to start by analyzing and theorizing this crisis of global capitalism, to move momentarily away from the headlines of the genocide in Gaza and of the student intifada in the United States and worldwide, step back and look at the big picture here. This crisis of global capitalism, it's multidimensional. It's an epochal crisis. It is an economic crisis or a structural crisis, what we call a chronic crisis of stagnation or overaccumulation. I'll explain what I mean shortly by overaccumulation. But it's also a political crisis. The system is facing a total political crisis of a loss of legitimacy, of state legitimacy, of capitalist hegemony. People around the world don't any longer see their governments and the system itself as legitimate. And as it spirals into a crisis of loss of legitimacy, the system responds with more and more viciousness. It's also a social crisis, an unprecedented levels of global inequality, social disintegration and social collapse wherever we go around the world. Whole countries are collapsing. Look at Haiti, the Congo, Sudan. Billions of people can no longer survive. It's a crisis of survival. It's not clear from one day to the next that billions of people that they will be able to survive. And finally, it's a systemic crisis because we are reaching the ecological limits to the reproduction of capitalism. So the capitalist states and the ruling classes, they can't control the explosive contradictions of this out of control system of global capitalism. And this pushes states to intensify the global police state. What do I mean then by global police state? Well, I'm identifying three things that all come together. The first is the extension, the escalation, the increasing sophistication of systems of transnational social control, repression, and warfare aimed at containing the global working and popular classes and surplus humanity. The types of extreme deprivation and extreme inequality in the United States and around the world require extreme control and extreme repression from the ruling groups. That's the first dimension of global police state. The second is that this is simply an accumulation strategy, a strategy for making profit, for keeping the global economy moving forward in the face of chronic stagnation, a lack of other opportunities for what I call the transnational capitalist class to make profits. They turn towards war and repression because simply the global police state is immensely profitable. And we're going to see exactly what I mean by that. So we are living in a global war economy, a permanent global war economy at this time. And that's the second dimension of global police state. The third is the frightening rise of far-right neo-fascist political projects. The ruling groups around the world, including in the United States, see so-called democracy, that it needs to be replaced, that there is too much space for us to mobilize from below, and are turning towards dictatorships, authoritarianism, and outright 21st century fascism. So these are the three dimensions that I mean by global police state. It's an analytical concept. that helps us try and make sense of everything going on in the world and how we have to respond to it. So we want to see how these three dimensions are intertwined in new ways that signal this new and extremely dangerous phase in global capitalism, with the crisis of the system as the backdrop. So what I want to highlight here is that this global police state is bringing about what we can call a deadly convergence of global capitalism's political need for social control in the face of unprecedented inequalities and this mass rebellion which is underway everywhere, and its economic need to perpetuate profit-making and capital accumulation in the face of stagnation. Those two come together. I'm sure you're familiar with the data that 1% of humanity at this time controls over 52% of the world's wealth, 20% of humanity control 80% of the world's wealth. That means, 95% of the world's wealth. That means that 80% of humanity have to make do with just 5% of the world's wealth. And that data is from 2018. This inequality is actually already deepened. So here's the thing, that this level of extreme inequality, it's intrinsic to capitalism. It's not a fluke. The natural functioning of the capitalist system produces this incredible social polarization, a mass of immiserated masses at one end and extreme wealth and power at the other end. And this has reached proportions we've never seen before. Just 17 global financial conglomerates and transnational finance capital is at the very core of the global economy, control $42 trillion in wealth, which is more than half of the entire global economy. So this inequality is a natural outgrowth of capitalism. Moreover, crises, permanent crisis tendencies are built into the way that capitalism functions. So what's going on with these extreme levels of inequality is that the masses cannot consume. So we have the global factories, the global plantations, the global mines, the global commercial centers, the global service centers. They're putting out all of this wealth, and the wealth cannot be absorbed by the global market because masses of people can consume less and less and less. So capitalism periodically has these crises. We know them as recessions. They come about once every 10 years, but right now we're in a bigger crisis. It's what we call a structural crisis, a deep structural crisis. They come around about every 40 to 50 years. The last 2008, the global financial collapse launched us into a new worldwide structural crisis of global capitalism. Before then, the last major structural crisis was the 1970s. Before that, the last major structural crisis was the 1930s, the Great Depression. And each of these crises were brought about by the natural functioning of the system, but each of the earlier crises, the 1930s, 1970s, they were resolved by a whole restructuring of the system. The 1930s, mass struggles, socialist movements, communist movements, mass trade union and worker struggles, all of these mass struggles in the United States and around the world, they forced on the system a redistribution of wealth downward, a regulation of capitalism, control and intervention by the state in the capitalist economy that brought about so-called New Deal capitalism or social welfare capitalism, social democratic capitalism. And then in the mass struggles of the 1960s into the early 1970s, even pushed that type of capitalism further to its very limits. And at this point, the capitalist class said, the popular classes, the working classes below us, they're gaining in class power. They're gaining in mass mobilization. They are challenging our hegemony. We have to respond to it. And the ruling groups then responded in the late 20th century and right up to date by going global, by launching capitalist globalization, by breaking out of the nation state, because us from below, the mass social movements, the mass worker struggles, we operate within the nation state. We place pressures on the state inside the nation state to gain, to curtail some of this power of capital, to redistribute wealth, to implement social programs, to give us our trade union rights, etc. And so capital breaks out of the nation state to get around that and launches capitalist globalization in the late 20th century and on. And so that throws us into the neoliberal nightmare that we have been in for the last 4 decades. We see rapid polarization to the extreme levels that we see now of inequality, the abandonment and tearing up of the social contract, the dismantling of the social welfare state, austerity. And of course, we're experiencing this in the United States, but this is all over the world. And a massive, massive continuing transfer of wealth from below to above. That's the last 40 some odd years of capitalist globalization. So globalization has been a prolonged class warfare from above, aimed at all of us. And this class warfare has also, because I want to get into some analytical points here that are critical to understand. This class warfare from above has accelerated the transformation of what we call the capital-labor relation. How is it that we, the working classes of the world, the popular class of the world, how do we face capital? Of course, we all antagonistically, our opposite of us is capital, but we face them under different historical circumstances that we fought for to improve those circumstances. But right now, we've seen it through capitalist globalization, an acceleration of this capital-labor transformation of that relationship to intensify exploitation around the world. The transnational capitalist class went on this offensive into the 5th decade now to recover the hegemony of capital, to rediscipline the global working and popular classes after our mass struggles of the 1960s and the 1970s, after the defeat of the third world liberation movements, etc. And what we see from the 1980s and on, feeling it very strongly now, is a wave of worldwide capitalist expansion, a voracious appropriation by this emerging transnational capitalist class of resources and of pools of labor around the world, unprecedented profit making. 1980s to date, this profit making, this expansion, while the masses of us move down and down to expanded immiseration. So we've seen, and I want to remember, I'm focusing here both on the United States and at a worldwide level. We've seen this vast wave of what we call technically primitive accumulation. Hundreds of millions of people, perhaps billions of people around the world have been displaced through 40 years plus of capitalist globalization, especially in what was the former third world in the countryside, and thrown into the global labor market. We, the working classes in each country and among all countries, been forced to compete with one another. Upwards to 3 billion people joined the global working class, the global proletariat, in these last four plus decades of capitalist globalization. The proletariat is now the biggest, largest class in history. We are 5 billion strong. I want to repeat that, the largest class in history. We are the future. Some of us speak about the age of the proletariat, the age of the proletariat. But the transnational capitalist class is engaged in this all-out assault against us. And their instruments are the political agents of global capitalism, of the transnational capitalist class in capitalist states. This is what's happening in Gaza. Gaza is central to this whole story. Again, it's the current flashpoint, but it's also a mirror facing us and saying this could be the future all around the world. And there's a turning point here with Gaza. That's what I want to emphasize. So we're the biggest class in history. We're going to be the ruling class if we win. 5 billion of us. But we're also the global proletariat under extreme difficult conditions. And I want to introduce here the term the precariat that many of you may have heard about. The idea of the precariat is that we're proletarians, but under precarious conditions, precarious work conditions, precarious conditions of survival, precarious political conditions. The International Labor Organization, which is an agency of the United Nations, they reported as far back as the late 20th century, right at the turn of the century, that 1/3 of the adult population in the world was already unemployed, structurally marginalized. I don't have to tell you, we're speaking, my hosts are the Poor People's Army. 1/3 of the adult population in the world. 2 billion people try to scratch out a living in the informal sector. Among those of us in the global proletariat that have work, 1.3 billion workers work under precarious conditions. So we're seeing this increasing precaritization all around the world of those of us that do have work and those of us that don't have work. The students that are storming our campuses, that are facing this brutal police repression right now, they're proletarians. They are future precarious workers. Here's another difference between 1968, that was when Andy became of age politically, and now. The class content of these students is very different. Sure, there are elite students at Harvard, at Yale, and I cannot stop unbelievably admiring them. They're giving up their privilege to fight this genocide. But the vast majority of these students on my own campus, the University of California, Santa Barbara, they don't come from the elite. They're facing, they could get a PhD. My graduate students get a PhD and become adjunct professors, precarious professors, working full-time year-round with no stability, no assurance of anything, no medical insurance, no vacation pay, and their wages for year-round is poverty level. And that's someone that gets a PhD. So these students, they are workers. They are academic workers. They are future precarious workers. So now I want to introduce another concept here, which is surplus humanity. This is a crucial category among the global precariat. Now, Marx spoke about surplus labor, that the capitalist system periodically expels members of the proletariat working for capital, expels them and makes them unemployed. He also spoke about a section being structurally permanently unemployed, locked out, marginalized and locked out. But he was speaking about 4, 5, 6% of the working class worldwide. Now we're talking about 1/3 or more and growing of the global working class. So this is the new category, surplus humanity. Right before we started this talk, I was reading The Economist. It's a capitalist, it's been around since Marx's time. It's a weekly. It's been around, it represents the interest and the perspective of the transnational capitalist class. I read it because you need to know how your enemy is thinking and analyzing the world. So literally a half hour before we started today, I was reading an article on India. And that magazine reported that there's 1 billion people of working age in India. Out of them, 100 million have formal jobs. 900 million are either unemployed or totally casually employed. So this is surplus humanity. This permanently locked out, subject to genocide. So we see these two faces of humanity, of the global proletariat, those marginalized, expelled, made superfluous, and those integrated into the circuits of global capitalist system, circuits, but integrated under the conditions of super exploitation and precariousness. I don't have to tell you that virtually all of the new jobs generated in the United States in the last few decades, and more every day is like this, are unstable poverty wages jobs. There's all kinds of terms we have for them: informal work, casual work, contract work, on-demand work, part-time work, temporary work, outsourced work. They're all just different titles we have for this new face of those of us that are in the labor market working. And what's already started and going to be accelerated, the proletarianization of professionals. I've already mentioned professors, and the digital decimation of professional work has already begun. So very simply, there's no escape except for the few lucky. Capital is coming for you. Capital is coming for us. So let me talk now more specifically about the structural dimension of the crisis of global capitalism, which begins really with the Great Recession of 2008. That 2008 global financial collapse brought about the end of the globalization boom. The ruling classes were so happy. They said it's the end of history. They said, you know, global capitalism, that's the end of the line and everything's wonderful. That was their discourse, and they got drunk with their happiness. And then 2008 happened. That globalization boom came to an end. The transnational capitalist class woke up with this drunken hangover. And this begins the onset of a new structural crisis of overaccumulation. I promised you I would come back to that term overaccumulation and explain what we mean by that. Well, if I'm a capitalist, I have only one objective: maximize profit. And the way I maximize profit is by minimizing wages. Now, I can minimize wages by going to cheaper labor zones, like go to China, go to Indonesia, go to India. If I'm in the rich countries, I can minimize labor by replacing human beings with robots, with technology. I can minimize labor by instituting fascism and a dictatorship and forcing wages down. There's many ways to do it. But here is the point of this structural crisis, that if I have $100 million as a capitalist, my only object is to accumulate more and more. So I throw the $100 million out in an investment. It comes back to me as 110 million, the 10 million representing my profit. Now I don't stop there, because capitalism can never stop. It's like riding a bicycle. You stop pedaling, it crashes the bicycle. Capital stops expanding, stops accumulating, it crashes down. So now I have my 110 million, I reinvest it. It has to come back 10% profit rate, 121 million, and so forth and so on. But at a certain point, because of this built-in crisis, because there's no global market, and for other reasons I won't go into, at a certain point, I look around and I don't find any new opportunities for profitable investment. So I can no longer continue expanding, and we are in crisis. And that crisis affects everyone because we're all integrated into capitalism. So must expand. That's why we speak of the endless accumulation of capitalism, ever faster expansion. And global police state is an instrument of the ruling classes for the constant expansion and now the violent expansion of capitalism around the world in the face of stagnation, to smash open and crack open new opportunities for accumulation, for profit making. Gaza is the leading edge right now. Palestinians, I'm going to come back to, why are they subject to genocide? One, they are surplus humanity, of no use to the ruling classes. So this goes way, way, way beyond the Zionists in Israel. And secondly, there are valuable resources that transnational capital has to get to in Gaza. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The point I want to say here is that the transnational capitalist class is running out of opportunities for profitable investment and for expansion. They have to seize new resources, new peoples, new territories. And they have to also expand in what we can call intensive expansion, privatize more and more, totally privatize public education, privatize what's left of any public sector, commodify everything. And the global police state is their instrument for doing so. So let me give you a piece of data, because the point here is that the transnational capitalist class has accumulated more wealth than we can wrap our minds around, yet it doesn't see where it can profitably reinvest that wealth. In 2024, as we speak, the leading transnational corporations that have been reporting, by the way, record profits since 2008, even as we had the pandemic, we had collapse, and they still have record profits. They are sitting on $17 trillion of uninvested cash, and they have to invest it. So enormous pressures build up to open up outlets for unloading this surplus capital, this surplus cash. And the biggest challenge that the ruling groups face right now, from their point of view, one, how do you keep the global economy going? How do you sustain accumulation? How do you sustain profit making in the face of this stagnation? So you have to violently crack open new spaces. You have the Gaza that I mentioned. You have Congo. In the last few months, 7 million people displaced in Eastern Congo. Is that a political conflict? Sure. Is it an ethnic conflict? Not really. But underneath it all is a conflict in which you remove those people to get at those resources through this violent expansion, through this global police state, and so forth. Argentina right now, we can talk about a strike of nearly 1 million people a few days ago. So this is what is behind the headlines: violently expand opportunities for capital to invest. And secondly, remember the two big challenges that the ruling groups face. The second giant challenge is, how do you control surplus humanity in the global working and popular classes? Because we're not sitting down with our arms crossed, we're fighting back. We are in full rebellion everywhere you go. So global police state is a response to those dual challenges. One, open up space and advance accumulation. Secondly, crush surplus humanity, and the global working class, where they stand in the way and when they resist. Now, I want to step back again, as Andy was saying, the importance of the more we understand the system, the better equipped we are to face it. So I want to introduce one other thing and say that over the last 20 years, since really 2001, the dot-com bubble, which was a recession, but especially since 2008, the ruling classes around the world, the transnational capitalist class, they've done three things to try and continue making profit in the face of stagnation. One is what we call debt-driven growth, meaning that for us working people, we had if we had lucky enough to have a house, we refinanced our mortgage just to pay for our kids' college education, or just to be able to continue consuming week by week, to make payments, etc. You know better than I know that 80% of households in the United States have no more than $400 in savings. You lose your job, you can't even pay next month's rent. But credit cards maxed out worldwide. This is worldwide. Consumer debt is at an all-time high. That's one way that the global economy has continued moving forward through debt. State or government debt is at an all-time high, all-time. And corporate debt at an all-time high. Global debt stands at $300 trillion. That compares to the whole global economy. The worth of the global economy is 80 trillion, and global debt is 300 trillion. So right now, you cannot continue debt-driven growth. That won't resolve for the capitalists their crisis. And we are maxed out on debt, those of us that even had access to debt. The second big mechanism of the transnational capitalist class has been financial speculation that you've heard so much about. The whole global economy is a casino for them. Turn everything into an asset with a financial value, speculate on these assets with financial value, commodify them, trade them, and so forth. That was behind the 2008 financial collapse. You turn all of these mortgages into financial assets that can be speculated on, and then it all came crashing down. So here, with this speculation, with this global casino, transnational finance capital is the hegemonic fraction of capital around the world. And it is ravaging our communities. I didn't quote, I was going to start with a quote by George Jackson. In fact, please, let me read the quote. And the reason I was going to start with it is because Andy had said, you know, he saw my quote from Fred Hampton. This book, I'm a little younger than Andy, but I was already the 1970s, a teenager. This is the original copy. Look, it's falling apart. The pages are all brown and everything. George Jackson, Blood in My Eyes. I was 17 when I read it. It really opened my eyes, started my road to political consciousness. But there was a quote I was originally going to start this talk with, and I want to read it now. He wrote in that book, "Revolution within a modern industrial capitalist society can only mean the overthrow of all existing property relations and the destruction of all institutions that directly or indirectly support existing property relations." Then he says, "Monopoly capital is the enemy. It crushes the life force of all the people. It must be completely, utterly destroyed as quickly as possible, utterly, totally, ruthlessly, relentlessly destroyed." He said that 50 years ago. And now I'm suggesting to you that as we analyze the global economy in crisis, the global capitalist system in crisis, and the war against us that it represents, transnational finance capital is the hegemonic fraction of capital. It's ravaging our communities. It is, as George Jackson said, crushing the life force of all of us people. So when we fight against gentrification, against expulsion, and people turned into homeless, that's transnational finance capital. When we witness the digital decimation of the jobs that still exist, that's transnational finance capital. Global police state is led, the leading aspect of global police state is transnational finance capital. It's deeply embedded and invested in the Israeli-US genocide in Gaza and in the repression of these students. So that's the second, this financial speculation that's kept the global economy going in the face of stagnation. The third, and the most important for this talk, and by the way, please bear with me, I'm about halfway done with the talk. The most important is that the ruling groups have been investing in what I term militarized accumulation, or accumulation by repression, meaning that wars, repression, social systems of social control become enormously profitable outlets for investing your capital when there's no other opportunities. So the global police state resolves both problems. It crushes surplus humanity and popular and working class resistance, and it makes enormous profits for you. So we've had this bogus wars on drugs, on terrorism, on immigrants, on gangs, on youth, the construction of border and containment walls, the expansion of prison industrial and immigrant detention complexes, these deportation regimes, the expansion of police, of military, of all these public and private security forces. We've had the containment of the working and popular classes and surplus humanity organized by the state through all of these systems. So here what we're seeing in all of these so-called wars, and by the way, the war on drugs, we know very well, has nothing to do with a war on drugs. It's a war on people. It's a war on social movements under the pretense of controlling drugs. The war on immigrants really has nothing to do with keeping immigrants out, because the US economy would collapse without migrant labor. The global economy would collapse without the movement of labor across borders. It's simply a way of massively controlling and dividing the global proletariat. The war on terrorism has nothing to do with terrorism, because the biggest terrorist entities on the planet are the US and the Israeli states, among others. Okay, so all of this is a way of making profit and conjoining profit making with social control. September 11 of 2001 begins this much more sweeping militarization of the global economy and society. In the years following 9/11, the Pentagon budget increased by 91% in real terms after taking account inflation. Military-industrial complex profits nearly quadrupled since 9/11, 400% increase, and they're still continuing. And in all of this, in this global police state, we see a fusion of private accumulation with state-driven and organized militarization. And by the way, this data on the Pentagon budget, that doesn't include secret budgets by the state, police budgets, intelligence budgets, homeland security budgets. It doesn't include how private corporations all around the world are spending on systems of repression and social control. Military, private security firms, private military firms now employ 15 million people worldwide. Everywhere you see war, everywhere you see repression, you're going to find private military and police firms. And these firms or these corporations are set up to make profit. So they attack us on our campuses in order to make profit. So privatized war and privatized repression. I also want to say that private police and security now number 20 million worldwide. Half of the countries around the world, the private police outnumber public police. And these are private corporations set up to do policing in order to make profit. And how do they make profit? By repressing us, but by also smashing open space for transnational capitalist class to seize resources and seize territory. Global market for homeland security in 2022, 2 years ago, was $500 billion. Now, let me see how I'm doing on time, 3:48. I want to mention Israel is one of the most militarized countries on earth. At the very core of the Israeli economy is this high-tech military industrial homeland security complex. But this is not just Israel. That complex, that Israeli economy, is deeply integrated into the whole global capitalist system, which is why when we attack the Israeli genocide, we're attacking the transnational capitalist class and why they respond to us with such ferociousness. Those students are threatening the very heart of transnational capitalist class interests. So genocide is quite profitable. We've seen a rapid increase in private for-profit prisons all around the world. We know about that in the US, 200 plus private prisons on all 5 continents as of 2023, a huge expansion of prison labor worldwide. Last year, approximately almost to the date a year ago, El Salvador in Central America opened the first mega prison with 40,000 prisoners. And then Thailand, from last year to this year, said that's wonderful. The Thai government, the Brazilian government, the Chinese government, they all announced that they are going to be opening up mega prisons. That's the wave of the future. And of course, the purpose here, not just to make profit, but to lock up surplus humanity. So the abolition movement, bless the heart of the activists involved in the abolition movement, but it frequently misses the point. In the first instance, mass incarceration is not about racism. It's about controlling surplus humanity by locking it up and by generating a climate through mass incarceration and through instilling fear in all of us, which is conducive to fascism, social control, to repression, from dividing us. The European Union Border Security Program, its spending increased, listen to this figure, 3,688% from 2005 to 2016. And all of that, everything you see in the Mediterranean with thousands of migrants dying, trying to get to Europe and everything, that is global corporations running those programs, not governments. That means massive profit persecuting immigrants, watching them die in the Mediterranean, watching them die at the US-Mexico border. So I could go on and on. I won't, because I want to wrap up fairly soon, and I still have a few more points to make. But I will say this also. I was going to read data, global riot control market. That's what the ruling classes call it, the riot control systems market. It's big business. And so the riot control that these police are doing on our campuses, that's also enormous big business. The ruling classes now call our resistance, they call it PVs, political violence contagion, PVCs, political violence contagion. But the point here, to wrap up this and move towards a conclusion, is that the ruling groups want war and repression for political reasons as much as for economic reasons. They kill two birds with one stone. The generation of conflicts and repression of social movements around the world and of vulnerable populations is an accumulation strategy, a strategy for making profit. That should not come as a surprise. And Biden just approved another 17 billion for Israel and another, I think it's 50 or 60 or 80 billion for Ukraine. When Russia invaded Ukraine, all of us said, what a horrible nightmare, terrible for the people of Ukraine, terrible for the people of Russia, terrible for the people of the world. But no, it's fantastic for the transnational capitalist class. Don't listen to their propaganda when they say they want the conflict to end. That is why a consultant for all of the leading military industrial corporations after Russia invaded said, happy days are here again. Now that phrase is not mine. I'm quoting a leading consultant for Raytheon, for Boeing. Happy days are here again. That is why a Goldman Sachs banker proudly proclaimed when Israel began its genocide in late 2023, an exact quote, this is great for our portfolio. So this is militarized accumulation, accumulation by repression, resulting in a direct transfer of wealth from us, from poor and working class to capital and the rich. There's nothing profitable about public health, education, housing, yet it's enormously profitable to send another 15 billion right now to Gaza, another 80 billion to Ukraine. So the money going to Gaza, it doesn't even leave the United States, it goes straight to the corporations. But the point is, that money goes to capital, for capital to very quickly kill Palestinians and simultaneously slowly kill us here through homelessness, unemployment, disease. So when we say our fate is bound up with those of Palestinians, it's real. It's not just a slogan. Our material fate, our survival is bound up with this. And then there is the indirect transfer of wealth because this global police state smashes open space for capital accumulation. I won't go into detail on Gaza, but note that there is oil and there is gas in Gaza. Note that one outlet from massive transnational corporate investment that they were licking their lips waiting to get in there was the whole Middle East. Saudi Arabia and Israel were supposed to normalize relations in September into October of this past year. They were about to do it when Hamas launched its attack. And so that's on hold. Why were they normalizing relations? Because then you reconcile all of the ruling classes in the Middle East and you can pour in with your capital and make massive profit. And so who stands in the way? Surplus Palestinian humanity. They have to be genocided. So the genocide in Gaza is a real-time alarm bell. that the ruling classes do not even care about their legitimacy at this point. They are experimenting with extermination in Gaza. The next step will be surplus populations elsewhere. So finally, I'm going to say one thing about digitalization, and then I want to wrap up with some comments for discussion. So on digitalization, I make this very quick. We're seeing this new round worldwide of capitalist restructuring driven by these new technologies, by AI, of course, artificial intelligence, by the Internet of Things, by 3D printing, by quantum computing, by big data, by bio and nanotechnology, etc. All of this, we're at the cusp right now of a new technological revolution. And under other circumstances, there could be our liberation. This could be fantastic. But this is in the hands of the transnational capitalist class. It's going to result in a further concentration of wealth and power in their hands, a further digital decimation of the global proletariat, and these new technologies are being applied and exercised through the global police state. These technologies are revolutionizing warfare, new modalities of repression, control, and genocide. That's why you've probably seen in the news that the Israeli genocide is using AI. It's AI, artificial intelligence-driven genocide. So I want to conclude now. I want to first conclude by saying, and thank you for your patience, I've been speaking more than I originally intended to. I want to first conclude by quoting Vladimir Lenin, who, as you know, was the leader of the Bolshevik Revolution. He was describing a pre-revolutionary situation. And I'm going to suggest to you that we are in, without any doubt, a pre-revolutionary situation. Lenin described three characteristics. One, when there is a crisis in the prevailing system, and it is impossible for the ruling classes to rule in the old way. We're right there, right now. Secondly, when the want and suffering of the oppressed classes have grown more acute than usual. We're right there. And third, when as a consequence, the masses increase their historic action. And we are right there. Those three conditions tell us we are in a pre-revolutionary situation. There is a general crisis of capitalist rule. Now, being in a pre-revolutionary situation and having a crisis of capitalist rule is good for us because we can't overturn the system if the system is not in crisis. However, so I'm not misunderstood, this jump from a pre-revolutionary situation to an actual revolutionary process, that jump is enormous. And we're not there now. And among other things, Lenin pointed out three conditions that we need to make the jump from a pre-revolutionary to an actual revolutionary situation. First, a widespread belief that change is possible and attainable. And that's just starting now. These young kids on campus, they feel it. Secondly, that a revolutionary ideology and program is there, and that's lacking. Many of us, of course, are trying, of course, all the time, but we don't have that yet. And third, revolutionary organizations, maybe political parties, maybe simply organizations, but revolutionary organizations capable of leading the struggle. Now, of course, I'm speaking with the Poor People's Army, so we have one of those revolutionary organizations. But we have an absence of radical trade unions. For instance, the working class here, if it belonged to radical trade unions and revolutionary organizations, could refuse to send the military equipment to Gaza, etc. And that's not the fault of the workers. That's just a long historic story, right? So I don't have the answers. You guys are leading, not me. You're in the front lines of our collective struggle. But I leave a few points here for open-ended discussion. The first is, again, speaking with you, I don't need to say this, but speaking to a larger mass of our peoples, we need to say it, that our identity is anti-capitalist, socialist, class struggle, class unity, precariat, proletariat. That's our identity. That's what I didn't quote Fred Hampton. I would have quoted his whole quote if there was time at the beginning, but that's what Fred Hampton was saying. That's what George Jackson was saying. Identitarian politics is an instrument of the ruling class meant to suppress our proletarian identity. Then there's the issue, and I won't go into detail again, I've taken up longer than I wanted to, the issue of how we develop new forms of struggle, because 1/3 up to 1/2 of the population is structurally unemployed and underemployed. So we need to rethink diverse forms of struggle in addition to the older forms of struggle. Another discussion point, I believe, and there's been a lot of discussion in this, we need a united front against fascism, but that doesn't mean voting for Biden. You can do that if you want, but I don't think a vote for Biden is going to block fascism. And then finally I want to say finally, by way of conclusion, the last big uprising was the BLM one, was after George Floyd was murdered, and we all saw that. That was in the middle of the pandemic. I went here, I live in LA. I went to the demonstrations. The first one, along with everyone else, I was tear gassed. The second one, I stood further back. I'm a little older. And so I saw this unbelievable yearning among these largely young people, ready to risk so much to overthrow the system, but with extremely low level, and with all total admiration and respect for them, it's not their fault, extremely low level of political consciousness and development. The slogans during that uprising they heard was F the police, F the police, F the police. I have no problem with effing the police. But here's the point. That uprising did not hit at the jugular veins of the global police state and global capitalism, of which it is an instrument. Make no mistake, the struggle against the global police state is a struggle against global capitalism. The police, and we see them on our campuses right now, they are the visible front line of the capitalist class and the capitalist state. They are there to enforce the power of capital and of the rich over the poor and the dispossessed. They are there to protect private property from the property list, which is the vast majority of us. That's why George Jackson said, smash private property, overturn property relations. The capitalists and the elites whose power and wealth is protected by the police, they don't go into the streets to confront workers and the poor. They command quietly from corporate boardrooms, banks, foundations, and government offices. So that's our real target. The greatest danger to all working people comes from the violence of global capitalism. We need to overthrow it. And that's what at this point, our very survival requires. So I'll stop there. And again, thank you so much for having invited me to this.
No, thank you so much. This is so informative. That's one of the things that, the Poor People's Army always striving to try to do is this each one, teach one, ensuring that the way that we move is based on have as much information about our enemy as well as we do about ourselves. And so we probably have, some questions in here. I'm looking in the chat. Right now, people want to raise their hand. I think Eric or Nick or someone can control the board and unmute people. Yeah, definitely. I know that's why, since 2000, we've been having these marches on the opening day of the Republican and the Democratic National Convention, just to ensure that people understand that it's not who you elect for president, it's not these politicians, but it's who's behind these politicians, that we need to know that neither one of them can never represent us if they're representing the corporations. I'm trying to see. A lot of people are saying best talk ever. Yeah, it definitely was very informative. Really, truly, put things in perspective. We hear a lot of information, but put it in a context where, it's overall, connecting the dots. Really, truly, thank you for that. Anybody had any questions or any comments?
By the way, Alan, I just want to say, by the way, Alan, it's an honor to see you here on the screen. I've seen you in YouTube videos and so forth, and now you're right in front of me on the screen.
All right, thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, Professor, that was awesome. It's funny because I was only supposed to be here for a couple minutes, and I just got so locked in and so engaged in this whole conversation. So thank you for being here. And so I made that comment in here where I said, what did I say? Yeah, so you were talking about how like capital is kind of, it needs to grow, and if there's no growing, then it collapses. And that's something that I feel like I had that knowledge at some point, but I never contextualized that to like how all these movements are happening, and how it relates to like poverty, how it relates to everything that we talked about today. But one of the things that I've noticed is just like, I don't want to use the word perversion, but I feel like it kind of is, because the last 5-6 years, there's so much hype around AI and around just technology in general, but especially right now, you hear a lot about AI. But before that, you heard a lot about the metaverse. You heard a lot about Web 3.0, which is the next version of the internet beyond this mobile thing that we all kind of use right now. And I lost the question, but I'm going to say what led me to the question was seeing how a lot of this capital is just consolidating, and they really want to create new markets because there's really nowhere. So I think that's part of the hype. The part of the reason why everyone's so excited about these things is because they know that this is kind of the last frontier. There's not a lot of room for capital to grow endlessly. So a lot of the new things that they're trying to make, and I'm reminded of Capital 3, fictitious capital, the segment about fictitious capital, where they have to make up fake capital. Like they have to make up fake markets. They have to make these digital things that don't even really exist, just to say, hey, let's, these physical versions of things that we have, let's make digital versions of them and then we can invest in that. While we destroy destroy the labor market and all that.
Yeah. So look, I'm looking. I see 3 hands that are up.
Yep. I was actually just about to call. Yeah.
We have
let me see.
Lewis.
Yeah. Do you guys want to speak?
We're
Should we
gonna
go
go
Lewis
with,
first? Did you see one up first? Because I can't see.
Lewis, Leslie, and Deborah. We'll go
All
on
right.
that.
Let's go with Lewis first. Yep, there we go. I think you're unmuted now.
Yeah, actually, I think Ibrahim was before me. I put my hand up after them.
Sounds good.
Thank you. Professor Ibrahim?
Yeah, thanks. Actually, Professor Liana next to me, she has a question.
Professor Robinson, you talk about overaccumulation and the ecological limits of capitalism in accumulation, because we don't have the surplus value which is created by labor to do accumulation. Could you expand a little bit about what you mean by overaccumulation?
Sure. Yeah. So what I mean by overaccumulation is that precisely that the capitalist class has accumulated all of this wealth and it's sitting in their hand, but they can't have it in their hand. It's stationary, right? It's not in movement, so it's crisis. That's stagnation, recession, or depression. Things stop, factories close, etc. Right? So overaccumulation that's why it's called overaccumulation. They've accumulated so much wealth in their hands, but they look out and say, now where can we invest it to continue to get more and more and more? So that's why it's termed overaccumulation. The irony of it is that it's literally undermining the generation of new wealth, right? That we all need. So that's why it's called overaccumulation. But I want to link that observation of overaccumulation with what I'm sorry, with the person. Your description below says poor people, so I mean not your name, but what you were saying. So that's why the transitional capitalist class is hoping that AI will resolve their problem of overaccumulation. It'll give them all these new investment opportunities, and it might in the short run, but in the mid run, it's going to only aggravate the crisis. So, so there's 2 things here. How do you resolve the crisis of overaccumulation? Well, they're hoping with AI. What happened was in the 1980s and 1990s, capital had, as it went global, it had 2 strategies. One was leave the rich countries, go and open up all these factories in China. That whole story we all know, deindustrialization here leaves us unemployed, structurally underemployed, deunionized. and then you go and super exploit labor in China, in Mexico, etc. So that, in technical Marxist terms, that's you seek to increase your profit and resolve overaccumulation and other problems by cheaper labor, by absolute surplus value, right? Squeeze out more from cheap labor. The other strategy capital has always had is what Marx called relative surplus value, which is you get more profit by eliminating workers, and so you don't have to pay them wages, and replacing them with robots and technology. So for the time being, both of those strategies work just momentarily. But now the chickens are coming home to roost. Those strategies don't work. And so that is why we're in this incredible crisis. The giant danger is that capital has always had another alternative to resolve its crisis, and that is war, world war. Not just talking now about the genocide, which is enormously profitable. Of course, sending this money to Ukraine, enormously profitable. It doesn't resolve the underlying structural problem, but the massive destruction of a world war does. It was World War II that finally got the US and the world economy back then out of depression. The total destruction of capital, so you start all over after there's hundreds of millions of deaths. And of course, we won't survive a World War III because of the conditions of global warfare at this point. There's this built-in war drive that we have to block. But just to, by the way, yeah, just leave it at that. But there's no long-term solution to this crisis of overaccumulation. That's why, in my view, these earlier big structural crises, I mentioned the Great Depression, 1930s, I mentioned the 1970s. Before that was the 1880s. Was a big structural crisis of world capitalism. Each time they managed to get out of it and to get the whole system going again. They might in the 2020s into the early 2030s with AI now, but at a longer term perspective, this is, in my view, a terminal crisis. It's what I call the epical crisis, because for ecological reasons, there's no more space to continue accumulating. And so that means that there's extermination and world war, or we now confront the system and overthrow it. So it's not to be alarmist, but we're in it. That's why I said we're in a different ball game in 2024 than we were in earlier moments when capital confronted us with its crisis and we had to fight back.
Louis, did you want
to? Yeah, thank you. Hi, Dr. Robinson. I'm actually a student at UCLA. I was in the encampment for both those nights. I'm glad you gave us a shout out. There's a lot of inspiring things there. My question comes, you're talking about the transnational capitalist class and needing to accept reforms when absolutely necessary to improve immediate conditions, but really looking for more revolution. Is something like BRICS, the BRICS agreement, that sort of throws a wrench, I guess, in the unipolar world. Would this be seen as an acceleration of the global police state, or is this something more of a slowdown of it? And I guess the same sort of goes with climate change. Is the conditions of climate change getting worse and worse? Is the global police state also sort of going to operate as a makeshift sort of immigration? What is I guess the politics of the armed lifeboat, basically. Fortification of national borders, is this also part of the imperative of the global police state, or is just sort of in the peripheral to it as something they will accomplish? Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic questions and observations. So starting with the BRICS, I think there's a mistake, confusion on the part of not just the US, but the left in many parts of the world to see the rise of the BRICS and this new multipolar world. Yes, politically, it's a multipolar world. Economically, it's a single integrated global capitalist system. And that's a contradiction in the system that we don't have time to talk about now. But the thing is, that does not represent our liberation, the rise of the BRICS, because these BRICS countries are led by ruthless capitalists and elites. They're simply forming the BRICS in order to get a better deal for themselves as they integrate into and in partnership with the capitalist classes and the ruling classes in the rich countries of the West. So the BRICS is not an alternative to global capitalism. The BRICS governments are fascist governments, they're repressive governments, they're exploitative governments. Look at who's joining the BRICS: Egypt, Saudi Arabia, India. India is a rising fascist government. We can debate China. I don't want to. We don't need to get into that here. South Africa. These are minority governments in the sense that they're elites and political and economic elites, and the BRICS is simply a way of getting them a bigger piece of this pie of exploiting and repressing all of humanity. Is it better that you have the BRICS in a multipolar world than this unipolar US world? Well, yes, and only in the sense that it opens up some space for us to maneuver from below and struggle in that way. So the other thing about climate change and GPS, I always do this. I estimate that I will be able to say more in a little amount of time. So I have to throw aside, half of what I was planning to say, which is fine. But one of the things I was going to point out is that we're moving towards fortress world, in the sense that privileged 15-17% of humanity around the world will live in what's called green zones. When the US invaded Iraq, it set up in the center of Baghdad what it called the green zone. And the green zone, and there was a buffer. There was a buffer all around it, so no explosive could get in, no one could get in. Inside the green zone, they quickly put into place the US military occupiers and political occupiers had their offices. The new Iraqi elite, brought to power by the invasion, set up their government and their privileged apartment buildings and houses. There were shopping malls, cinemas. That's inside the green zone. They lived all comfortably and happy, while all around there was this warfare and hundreds of thousands of people dying. So fortress world, which they're putting into place, is global green zoning. Some of you are in Chicago, me and Luis were here in LA. You set up, it's not that the whole country of the United States or the rich countries is the green zone and the rest of the world is the war. No, it's within our very communities. There's green zoning, and then there's outright warfare like Gaza, and then the mass of us live in gray zones. So the green zones is right here in LA. It's the privileged communities where you have global police state protecting them. And their privileged communities have their shopping malls and their privileged housing and et cetera, et cetera. You know the whole story. And outside of these little green zones in each country are the gray zones where global police state is thrust to keep control. And so you're getting this, this fortress world being put into place. How does that connect with climate change? Well, one thing going on with climate change is that it's actually profitable. Again, capital is sociopathic. So anytime there's any problem, capital doesn't say, oh, this is bad for people, how can we resolve it? Capital says, oh, wow, how can we turn this into profit making? So there's all of these schemes for turning climate disaster into profit making. And there's no time to go into all of the details, but that's also where global police state comes into the issue of climate catastrophe, because global police state, one, has to massively suppress the environmental justice movement, prevent it from linking up with trade union and working class struggles and linking up with anti-genocide struggles, but we're making those links. But global police state represses climate justice movement. Look at Standing Rock. Look at what happened there. First of all, the indigenous in Standing Rock, the Native Americans, they're surplus humanity. Capital wanted those resources, get the oil out of Canada, get it through the United States. Indigenous just standing in the way, surplus humanity, crush them. The people that crushed them were private corporations. So the state came in, but it was private corporations. And those indigenous defending their land and their lives, but also from the incredible ecological destruction, right? So the point I'm trying to get at is that climate change, the disruptions and the dangers that it represents, is not only a new opportunity for profit making for the transnational capitalist class, but also to make that profit. And to turn climate change into profitability, you need global police state's repressive dimension as well. So this is all connected. That's why I introduced the concept of global police state. It's not something you look at in the eyes. You see police, but it's much more than that. It's a concept that helps us understand all of these different connections, right?
Go ahead, Leslie.
Hi. Yeah, sorry, I'm not kind of a ghost here. Not really very presentable tonight. I really appreciate this discussion, Professor, because I think right now the most important thing is that we all start getting dialogues going. The problem that we have, is that there's a few of us who are studying the situation and gathering the facts and realizing that we are living under a fascist state. It may not be showing itself in ways that, we remember, Nazi Germany, movies portraying, but it is portraying itself as fascism, and it's slaughtering people, as you pointed out, in Gaza and all over the world. So we're not approaching fascism. We are in fascism. And the problem is that our class is uneducated, that it doesn't realize that the ruling class is at war with it. And this resistance that we have in various places and forms that's popping out all over the world is like a spontaneous reactions and abhorrence to conditions. But it's not what we need in order, like, to be able to grasp what you were saying, that the solution is the destruction of private property. And I don't mean your toothbrush in your house or your car. Talking about the fact that the corporations own all of the resources and the machinery, the tools. And that's the other thing I wanted to talk about. Well, first of all, just to say that I think this is only the start. We can't possibly talk about everything in one evening. And, but I think one thing that's really important is this whole question of the technology. Because, like, as you were saying, it's one of the devices that capitalists employ, but it's not exactly a choice, is it? I mean, like you were saying, a capitalist it's like riding a bicycle. You can't stop. And it's the same thing with employing technology in production. There is no stopping that. It's constantly competing, for selling of commodities. So the faster you and cheaper you could produce those, the more supposed profit there will be there at the end. So it's very key. And I think one of the things that I learned from studying Marx as a young woman is that when the tools change, that's when revolutions commence. Just as under feudalism, the capitalist relations were already beginning to blossom in their, primitive forms. And that was bound to come full-fledged as capitalist relations and capitalist production developed. I think what we're seeing, though, is the end of capitalism, in the sense that if you have machines, if we have lights out factories, if we have machines doing all the work, and like you said, changing us into like a precariat hustlers on the side, scrambling for pennies outside of any point of production. There is no worker at the point of production in the classic sense that there was in the beginnings of capitalism. But on the other hand, the people, the small ruling class is going to continue to keep all of its private property. So how it's got a problem. I mean, how does it keep its private property as capitalism dissolves? And I think that's what you were so eloquently describing to us about the nature of its crisis. However, I think that the message that I would bring, because I think this is our problem right now. We have to figure out a way to unite our class, which is seriously divided all the time, by this identity politics, or by telling us that immigrants are the problem, and all of the various ingenious ways. These are not just ideas that they're telling people. They're actually, for instance, like flooding the cities with immigrants. And the people go, well, they're here for my job. And they are. That's what they brought them up here for, is to drive us, to discipline us, to drive us down when we're demanding $15 an hour. Fuck that. Why should they settle for that when there's starving masses everywhere that they've created that they can bring up here and introduce into the labor force? But all these divisions are real. And how will we bridge them? This is the question. And I think that the answer is that any kind of program we develop has to be that we are united as a class around the basic survival needs. These are the things that we need to come together around. We all need shelter that we can afford. We all have to provide for ourselves and our families and our necessities of life. So these are the basic things. And how are we going to do that? What kind of a new society can we have? And it's all there. The technology that we are talking about here that they're using against us is all available. If we took it over, we could 3D print all the homes, or, we could take care of ourselves like in a paradise. And I think that is more and more becoming something that people can actually see is a reality, that it is possible. So finding ways of communicating this, I think, is what Poor People's Army is trying to do, what I'm trying to do, and Andy's trying to do, what all these people probably on this call are trying to do right now. So I would just say that I think we should continue with these kinds of discussions, study circles, forums, book groups, you name it. Getting people talking will get people learning, and we'll get that closer to maybe being able to come together in some kind of a fashion to have our own political muscle, our own political party, because I think that's where things begin to drive towards.
Yeah, that kind of leads into one of the questions that was in the chat. Sharon reached out and on what are some of the things you could do, to make change without risking your life. And so I'm gonna throw that out there to you, Professor, but also want to give Deborah, a quick chance to be able to make her comment or ask her questions so the professor can kind of like hit those.
Hi there, can you see me?
Yes. How you doing?
Okay. So I just want to say that this is one of the best talks I've ever heard and the best discussion. So I'm just thank you from the bottom of my heart for putting this together, all of you, and especially you, Professor Robinson. I work internationally. We have a network that is in over 80 countries, and we work with very poor and very marginalized communities all over the world. And we do these things called field hearings, where we go into the communities. And when I say we, I don't mean people from the United States that look like me. I mean the local people that are in our network go into communities with people that they already know and are familiar with and have a relationship of trust, and run a whole series of questions to understand what's going on there and what's wrong and what do they want to have happen and what are they willing to do, what do they want help from us to do, in terms of being an international network. So I'm getting input from around the world on a daily basis. And there's some countries that I work in very closely, and I'm talking with people, like hourly. For example, Democratic Republic of the Congo, where, as you pointed out in your talk, there's, right now, I think the latest figures I saw were 6.9 million internally displaced people, and then several other million that have had to flee the country. And I could talk about that for hours, but it's exactly what you said. It's a movement by capital to control the resources in that country. And to do that, they have to get rid of the excess people who are in their way where they want to go do their mining and so forth. But one of the things that I see all the time is that the problems in each different country, you know, there's a little bit of difference between each country, but they are not just based in that country. They are coming often, almost always, from external sources who are then working hand in glove with the local elites who intend to get rich off of collaborating with these outside forces. And these outside forces are almost always the United States, the European Union, you know, various countries in the European Union, the UK, and Israel. And I see this repeatedly. And of course, Russia and China are also in a lot of these countries. I especially work in many African countries, but they don't behave in the same way. But the global West are the ones that are the really, really bad actors in all these places. And so here's my question to you. When you see that this is happening, that these relationships have been established and continue to happen for decade after decade, and that they're resulting in just destroying people's countries and people's lives. For me, the lesson I derive from that is that it's incumbent upon those of us who live in one of those you know, perpetrator states, the global rich countries, to reach out and establish a relationship with the people who are being slaughtered in those other countries and say, what can we do? How can we help? What do you need from us? How can we collaborate to have an international movement to try and get these things stopped? But a lot of people don't want to see that happen, and they talk about it. It's kind of the same way that people talk about identity politics in the U.S. Like each different identity group is supposed to just keep to itself and just work with other people who are the same, and you know, don't be reaching across to another group of people. Just mind your own business and let them do their thing and you do your thing. And I get a lot of negative feedback that I have no business being involved in what's going on in another country. But yet the United States is already very much involved by what they're doing. They're wreaking havoc in those countries. And so I feel that it's important for us to have an international movement and international, you know, solidarity and collaboration and dialogue and information sharing and strategy, you know, planning, that we need to be doing that together. And now I'll be quiet and see what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, Leslie, and there was your comments are, you know, unbelievable. We could spend the next, you know, hours discussing all of this. They're just so important. But so let me work backwards. I can't agree with you more, Deborah. I've been arguing, and not alone, of course, that and this has been, what I'm about to say has been said now for 30 years, right? Capital has fully transnationalized, resistance from below, struggle from below, class struggle from below, social struggle from below has to transnationalize. But that has not moved, and this is where we have all the work to do. That hasn't moved from old notions of solidarity, you know, proletarian internationalism. Okay, you got your struggle, we got ours, we support each other. And we have to move way beyond that. We need a new type of transnationalism, in which, you know, one of the big debates we had, it wasn't so much academic, it wasn't in academia, but it was too much an intellectual debate. But Samir Amin, he died a few years ago, but he called for a new international. And in this international, then he died. And so we had a big forum, a lot of, you know, articles were published, again, not in academia, on how you conceive of the new international, linking all of these social movements, all of these, you know, these struggles in a more organic way, not just supporting each other, but actually organic organizational connections, which is what we need. And one of the things he called for, that I agreed with this part of his call, that the old internationals were political parties. And number one, we still need political parties, political organizations. A lot of nonsense when people say we can transform the world without political organizations. That's my view. But the thing is, he was calling for an international, or I call it a transnational, which is social movements and political organizations, right? And then agreed upon minimum program worldwide across borders. We tried to do that in the World Social Forum, but unfortunately, not just identity politics, but this notion that you shouldn't have programs and you shouldn't have political organizations undermined that effort. It had its historic moment, but it didn't go anywhere. So I can't agree with you more, Deborah, that we need to think, what are the new forms of transnational struggle? As far as saying that we have no business, getting involved in other people's struggles, that's a lot of nonsense, because it's all of our same struggles. It's true that the people in Gaza are subject to genocide. We're here and we're the students are being repressed and clobbered by police, but we're not yet being subject to all on, physical genocide. But again, our fate is bound up with the fate of the people in Gaza. And those people in Gaza, they're not saying stay out of our struggle. I don't know where that call comes from. It's none of our business, other people's struggles. They want to link up with us. They thank us, just thanking the students painting on their tents. Thank you to the students. As far as your observation that it's the United States, the Western states that are leading all of this, that is completely true. And I know that everyone I'm speaking to now knows this, but let's reiterate it. That's the idea of understanding the nature of the capitalist state. States are instruments of the capitalist class. We don't go back to Lenin, we can go back to last century. So when the United States intervenes all over, when the European Union intervenes, whether it's the Congo, whether it's in Israel, wherever it is, it's the capitalist state simply opening up space and repressing and creating the conditions for capital to accumulate. So sure, we're facing these states, but behind them, all of the world's people are facing those capitalist interests. I want to mention something else. Congo is this extreme example in the sense that the local elites want to see this foreign intervention and the transnational corporations because they link up with it and they get rich and powerful at a local level. But that's in the Congo. The reason I'm saying it's an extreme example that in other states, you're not talking about tiny little junior partners. If you look at Brazil, if you look at India, if you look at China, if you look at Saudi Arabia, the local elites linking up with transnational capital, they themselves are part of the transnational capitalist class. They're not little junior partners. They're calling the shots as well. Brazilian capitalists are invested here in the US and Canada and exploit US and Canadian workers. Cemex is the biggest Mexican corporation in the world, and they exploit U.S. workers, multi-ethnic, multicolored, when I got to the Philippines a few years ago, the first thing I got out of the airport and I saw a big sign, Cemex, and here's Cemex, get your cement from Cemex. Those are Mexican-based transnational capitalists, and their corporations are traded on Wall Street. So I can become, link up with Mexican capitalists. I didn't get a chance to talk about how the anti-immigrant movement starts with profit making, not with anything else. And that Corrections Corporation of America, now called CoreCivic, anyone can invest in it. And in fact, when you look at who's invested in CoreCivic, they run all of these private detention centers here in the US. The investors are Chinese financial holding companies, right? And Gulf holding companies. And in addition to, US investors. So we have to think through these national borders conceal what are really an integrated global ruling class, despite their differences, despite their political differences. And these global ruling classes have the particular national conditions you're talking about. And so how do we transnationalize and globalize? I don't have the answers, right? We're putting out the big questions. I wanted to say something about, a few things that Leslie was suggesting. A 21st century fascism will not look like 20th century fascism. That's very clear. And if we theorize what was the nature of 20th century fascism, well, three things came together. First of all, reactionary repressive power in the state. So the Nazis, Mussolini, they took over the state, the German and Italian states. Franco took over the Spanish state. That has to link up with two other things. Secondly, for have fascism, you have a fascist mobilization in civil society, right? It's not just a dictatorship in the state. You have a fascist mobilization, right? And the lack of a left right now in the United States, a mass left, that can reach the mass of working people is giving fascists the opportunity to mobilize them in civil society. Because all workers, all poor people, all working people in the United States are suffering socioeconomic destabilization, downward mobility. There's all this rising social anxiety. And it's legitimate because everyone's suffering. And without a left message to them, the fascists come and they have their populist message. Well, we recognize your social anxiety. We'll give you security once again. But what I'm getting at is always fascism is the state, but secondly is this fascist mobilization of civil society. And third, it's still not fascism till it links up with capital and meets the needs of capital. In the 20th century, that was national German capital, national Italian, national Spanish capital, linking up with fascist civil society mobilization and fascist power in the state. Now, it's those first two and transnational capital. And that's what we're seeing right now. And it's not going to look like the 20th century because there's new methods of communication, new methods of entertainment, new methods of creating passivity, new methods of atomizing people in their own isolated little world. So you don't need to stop electoral processes. You control the electoral processes while you have actual fascism, 21st century fascism. So you're still going to have electoral processes in Argentina, in Brazil, here in the US. Trump wins again. Or maybe you won't. Maybe you won't. But the point is we can look, we're looking at fascism right there coming towards us. And it's not, don't look for concentration camps and Nazi ideology. Look for its 21st century version. Finally, I'm sorry, but your comments were so rich, right? They require a little bit of elaboration in responding. Leslie, had pointed out that we're reaching the end of capitalism. That's true. That's why I call it an epochal crisis of capitalism. But remember also, when capitalism is deeper gets into this epochal crisis, the more dangerous capitalism, global capitalism becomes. So I think capital cannot stop this crisis, right? Our task is to not let it take humanity down with it. We know that. But I just want to point out, capital cannot resolve its own crisis. Only we can. And in the past, we resolved it by reforming capitalism. Now, I don't see how can we reform global capitalism in the midterm, in the next 10, 20 years or so. Anyway, I've talked way too much.
Reality, not enough, because there's so much, right, to talk about. We have a couple questions in the comments. I don't know if you want to summarize them. How long we were going to go to, Galen? 7:30 or 8?
I don't know if you're asking. If you're asking me, I'm thrilled and honored to be here, and I have no time limit myself. But sure, we do.
I do have one question here that's fantastic, and I think it's a little bit, I guess, about. Well, actually, it'll consolidate some of these questions, because we have a question here about how can we encourage people to get involved in the movement who are scared of arrest or losing their job. We have one that is, what are the odds of us making change without risking our lives? We did mention that earlier. And then we have another one here from Ariel. How do we educate those in the police force or army? They are recruiting at an all-time high amongst youth who aren't fully educated in this way and are being lured with promises and housing and benefits that they don't have to go abroad. And youth are really being targeted and are not being educated in school on this front. So that's a good little consolidation of those things. We have a couple of replies too, but yeah, was wondering your take on that. We could probably end on that too, if anyone else has any quick questions in here.
Right. As far as how do people engage in this struggle without losing their employment and having the state and the ruling groups attack us back, our only real defense, some of us are privileged enough, myself, they've come after me a number of times. If they have the slightest mess up, they will run me from the University of California, but currently I can still speak out, but many people can't. And I think the only defense for the masses of people is it becomes so massive, those that are speaking out, that it's not possible. You can fire 2 or 3 people. You can't fire a whole labor force, right? So that's why we need, the radical unions to get on board in this. But that's the only real defense. The more massive and the more people involved in mass struggle, the more each individual involved in that struggle is defended from this type of repression. whether it's the absolute physical repression or losing your job or whatever. As far as the army and police, this has been a long time discussion, and my own thinking on it is that it's very, very difficult to reach police. They are trained to really be simply this repressive, blind repressive force of the property class and the states that mobilize them. I don't see how to really reach police beyond a few of them. But the army is another matter, because although there's no draft, it's just as you pointed out, the army is filled with people that are just there because there's no other employment opportunity, because they're trying to escape from poverty. They're trying to be able to get a university education with it being paid for when you get out. So I think in the longer run, there's plenty of recruitment to do in the armed forces. What you had, I know it's a silly example, maybe just because we don't know how generalized it is, but when Aaron Bushnell, he emulated himself, and then there were all of these comments by soldiers that are in the armed forces, not retired, and they were saying, we feel like him, we admire him for what he did. And that leads me to another comment. My students, there has been a sea change. Of course, they're still bombarded with, and they still have their identitarian thinking. They still don't fully think like proletarians, in our class, the language we use here. Nonetheless, I had another career, another life. I was in the Central American revolutions for close to 20 years. That's another story. But I got into academia my really first fixed job in academia is only 2001 in the University of California, where I am now in Santa Barbara. So I've been teaching for 23 years there. And I've noticed a sea change in the last 2-3 years only. And earlier in the 2000s, I couldn't mention Marx. I couldn't talk about socialism. I couldn't say communism. I couldn't talk about revolution. They wanted to talk about identity politics and all of this nonsense. And now, totally to the contrary. They're not scared by not even just socialism. I can talk anti-capitalism, socialism. They eat it up. They recognize it. I talk about communism. I talk about Marx. They're hungry and thirsty to hear about this stuff. So the younger generation doesn't have the indoctrination from the Cold War and from the old anti-communism. They have the other problems we mentioned. How do you get them beyond the identitarian, sectarian problems? But that's really good. I mean, that's a sea change. And that's, we're giving, what do you call it? When you're running in an Olympic run and you give the
Pass the baton?
The baton, right. We're giving the baton to this generation that we have, that is inspiring so much, hope and inspiration.
Yeah. And thank you so much, Professor. This was truly, people be like, oh, that's a deep discussion, that you really have to have, and you need quite a few hours, or quite a few sessions. And so I definitely want to make sure, people, I don't know, I think when people signed up, for their email, so they'll be able to get the recording. Just saying that, us with the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign, the Poor People's Army, we have our march coming up, July 15th in Milwaukee, opening day on the Republican National Convention. And we'll be marching, from Milwaukee down to Chicago, for the opening day of the Democratic National Convention. And, we got a lot of stuff that's going on in between. Professor, I don't know what you might do in between August the 3rd and August the 17th, but throughout those 2 weeks, we're going to have different speakers, different people come in and educate and, have deep discussion. And this whole global police state, and getting people to understand we're not just talking about the physical police and the military, but how all of it's all connected and policing us all. Very, very, very deep fracking type discussion today. Thank you all so much. I want to thank everybody for being on, and thanks Andy. Thank Andy, for reaching out, to the professor and the Poor People's Army. I'll see y'all all somewhere in the struggle. All right.